General George Smith Patton Jr. was not like other generals. He didn't blend in, he didn't hold back, he didn't apologize. He was bold, brash, deeply disciplined, and obsessed with the art of war. To some, he was a genius, a master of maneuver warfare, a battlefield poet who could see the front lines like a chessboard. To others, he was reckless, difficult, even dangerous, but no one could deny his impact. Patton helped shape the course of World War II, and in doing so became one of the most recognizable military figures in American history. This is his story. George Patton was born on November 11th, 1885, in San Gabriel, California. From a young age, he was steeped in military tradition. His family traced their roots back to Confederate officers, and Patton was raised with stories of valor, honor, and battlefield glory. He idolized ancient warriors. He read Caesar, Napoleon, and the Bible. War to him was both a science and a calling. He attended the Virginia Military Institute for a year, then transferred to West Point. He struggled academically, particularly with mathematics, but excelled in leadership, physical training, and especially in the cavalry. He graduated in 1909 and was commissioned into the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant. Patton's early military career was a study in ambition. He craved action. In 1915, he served under General John J. Pershing during the U.S. expedition into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. There, he led a daring raid that earned him Pershing's attention. A few years later, when the U.S. entered World War I, Patton pushed hard for a frontline command. But it wasn't horses that interested him now, it was machines. Patton became one of America's first tank officers. He trained with the French and helped develop U.S. tank doctrine. He led the first American tank assault during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. Wounded in action, he crawled through shell fire to direct his men. That moment, his leadership under fire, his refusal to quit, became part of the Patton legend. After World War I, the Army downsized. Patton remained in uniform, cycling through staff positions and posts around the country. He became a student of military history and technology. He believed the next war would be fast, mobile, and armored. While many officers still thought in terms of trenches and fixed lines, Patton envisioned mechanized warfare, tanks, trucks, and movement. He spent the interwar years writing papers on armored tactics, advocating for new weapons, and perfecting his philosophy of leadership. He was tough on soldiers, demanding, but he led from the front. He believed discipline saved lives. He also believed in the will to win, that the spirit of the soldier, properly focused, could conquer any obstacle. Then came 1939, war in Europe. And 2 years later, after Pearl Harbor, America entered the fight. Patton was ready. He was given command of the Western Task Force for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942. This was America's first major ground operation against Axis forces. Patton's arrival in Morocco was dramatic. He stepped ashore in full dress uniform, pearl handled revolvers on his hips, barking orders with clarity and precision. He took command of American forces after initial setbacks against the Germans. Morale was low, training had been insufficient, but Patton changed that. He enforced discipline, reorganized units, installed confidence. He once said, "It is better to have a good plan violently executed now than a perfect plan executed next week." That was Patton in a sentence: decisive, forward moving, and allergic to hesitation. He led his forces into battle against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. While Rommel himself was in Germany at the time, Patton's troops faced seasoned German armor in the Tunisian desert. With the support of British forces, they pushed the Axis back. The campaign ended with Allied victory in North Africa and Patton's star on the rise. But the real test was still to come. After victory in North Africa, the next Allied move was clear: strike at Europe's southern underbelly. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Patton was placed in command of the U.S. 7th Army, while British General Bernard Montgomery led the British 8th Army. The two were supposed to operate in tandem, Montgomery moving up the East Coast, Patton on the West, but their relationship was uneasy from the start. Patton respected Montgomery's intellect, but bristled at his ego. Monty, for his part, saw Patton as aggressive, flamboyant, and dangerous. The tension between them would become a defining feature of the campaign. When German resistance slowed Montgomery's advance toward the key city of Messina, Patton saw an opening. He shifted his objectives, pushed his forces hard, and raced Montgomery to the city. It wasn't just about strategy, it was personal. Patton wanted to prove that American troops could fight as well as any in the world. He launched bold amphibious landings, ordered rapid armored thrusts, and pushed his men through brutal mountain terrain. The result, Patton's forces entered Messina first, just hours ahead of Montgomery. It was a symbolic victory, and Patton knew it. But the Sicilian campaign was also the first time the public began to see the contradictions of George Patton. His drive for discipline was absolute. He believed that fear could be defeated with resolve, that courage could be ordered into existence, and it was that belief that led to the darkest chapter of his career. In August 1943, Patton visited several military hospitals in Sicily. At one field hospital, he encountered a soldier suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, what we now know as post traumatic stress disorder. The soldier had no visible wounds, and when he told Patton he simply couldn't take the shelling anymore, Patton lost his temper. He slapped the man, called him a coward, and ordered him back to the front. A few days later, Patton did it again, this time with witnesses, including journalists and doctors. The story was held by the press at the request of the War Department, but word spread within military circles. Soldiers were outraged, doctors were furious, and when the story finally broke, the public was shocked. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was faced with a decision. Patton had helped turn the tide in North Africa and Sicily, but his behavior was unacceptable. Eisenhower reprimanded him harshly and forced him to apologize to the men he had struck one by one. Patton obeyed, but the damage was done. He was sidelined, not relieved, but benched. And as the Allies planned the greatest invasion in history, the D-Day landings in Normandy, Patton, the Army's most aggressive field commander, was left without a role. It was a bitter pill for Patton. He saw himself as destined for battlefield command. He believed in fate, in reincarnation, in the soul of the warrior. Being left out of D-Day was, to him, a kind of death. But Eisenhower had another plan. Knowing that the Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander, Eisenhower put him in charge of a phantom army, the first U.S. Army group, based in southeastern England. Using fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and false intelligence leaks, Patton's army convinced German commanders that the real invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The deception worked. German forces remained tied down far from the actual invasion zone, and when the Allies stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944, they faced less resistance than they might have otherwise. Patton, benched but not forgotten, had helped win D-Day without firing a shot. Still, he wanted back into the fight, and he would get his wish. By July 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but the fighting was slow and brutal. The hedgerows of northern France turned the countryside into a maze of ambushes. Every village was a fortress. Progress came at a crawl. That was about to change. In August, General George Patton was given command of the newly activated U.S. Third Army. His exile was over. And once the breakout from the Normandy beachhead began, Patton didn't waste a second. His troops surged forward. The German front collapsed. In just 2 weeks, Patton's forces advanced over 400 miles, a pace no Allied formation had yet achieved. The enemy was stunned. Patton's style of war was on full display. Movement, momentum, relentless pressure. He drove his units hard, sometimes dangerously so. Fuel became his biggest enemy. His tanks often outran their supply lines. There were moments when entire columns stalled, not from German resistance, but from lack of gasoline. Patton famously quipped, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." His command style was direct and personal. He issued daily bulletins to his troops. He visited the front constantly. His speeches, fiery, vulgar, and unforgettable ones, were delivered with purpose. He believed in the power of morale, of myth, of warrior spirit. "I don't want to get any messages saying I am holding my position," he told his men. "We are not holding anything. Let the Hun do that." As Third Army swept across France, Patton liberated town after town. His troops crossed rivers, punched through defenses, and encircled retreating German forces. The most famous example came at the Falaise Pocket, where Patton's forces helped trap tens of thousands of German troops. Many escaped, but the blow was severe. By September, Patton's army had reached the Moselle River and approached the German border, but the advance slowed. Supply shortages, stiffening resistance, and complex terrain all combined to halt the momentum. And then winter arrived. In December 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war, the Ardennes counteroffensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans broke through the American lines, and snow, fog, and chaos descended across the front. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne was cut off. Eisenhower called a crisis meeting of his top generals. Patton was there. While other commanders scrambled to react, Patton calmly announced that he could pivot his army north and strike the German flank in 48 hours. Many in the room didn't believe it. His forces were already engaged on the Saar River. The weather was atrocious. The roads were jammed. But Patton had already anticipated the move. He'd ordered contingency plans. He was ready. Third Army turned north. In one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, Patton redeployed multiple corps over icy roads, across rivers, and through towns already stretched thin. On December 26, 1944, elements of his army broke through the German ring around Bastogne, relieving the siege and reinforcing the airborne troops who had held the town against impossible odds. It was a textbook example of Patton's philosophy: speed, aggression, and initiative. While other commanders waited, he moved. While others hesitated, he struck. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, and Patton helped crush it. In the final months of the war, Patton continued to drive into the heart of Germany. He captured bridgeheads, liberated concentration camps, and swept through Bavaria. His army moved with breathtaking speed. In one stretch, they advanced 100 miles in 48 hours. Town after town surrendered at the sight of his tanks. But even as victory approached, Patton remained controversial. He frequently clashed with Eisenhower and British commanders over strategy and credit. He made unfiltered comments to the press, some of which threatened Allied unity. He was fearless on the battlefield and equally reckless off it. Yet among his men, loyalty to Patton ran deep. He was the kind of general who knew their names, who visited their foxholes, who led from the front. They fought hard for him. They bled for him. They believed in him. By May of 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over, but for General George Patton, the fight was far from finished. With the German surrender in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But for General George S. Patton, the battle never truly ended. He had led the U.S. Third Army across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, liberated towns, saved surrounded divisions, and proven himself one of the most capable combat commanders in modern warfare. But peace was not Patton's natural state. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's collapse, Patton was placed in charge of the U.S. occupation zone in Bavaria. His new mission was administrative: help rebuild, restore order, and oversee the denazification process, the removal of Nazi influence from German society. But Patton had never been a politician, and his blunt, unfiltered views quickly drew attention. He allowed many former Nazi Party members to retain positions in local government if he believed they were useful or not ideological extremists. His rationale was simple: Germany needed to function, and many people had joined the party out of necessity rather than belief. But in the eyes of Washington and the press, it looked like Patton was too lenient, even sympathetic. That impression grew worse when he compared former Nazis to members of the Democratic and Republican parties, a remark that sent shockwaves through the media. At the same time, tensions were rising between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war had barely ended, and already the seeds of the Cold War were being planted. Patton, always outspoken, didn't hide his feelings. He distrusted the Soviets. He believed they were not liberators, but future enemies, and he wasn't quiet about it. He told friends and reporters that the U.S. should have kept going, that they should have pushed the Red Army back, even to Moscow if necessary. He saw Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe as a betrayal of freedom. "We defeated the wrong enemy," he once told an aide, a comment that would follow him to his grave. His superiors, especially General Eisenhower, were alarmed. Patton's continued inflammatory statements, his mishandling of occupation duties, and his resistance to political guidance finally forced action. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of his command of Third Army and reassigned to a lesser role with the 15th Army, a historical documentation unit with no combat responsibilities. For a man like Patton, it was exile. He knew it. He felt it, and he wasn't quiet about it. In private letters, he vented his frustration. He believed he was being silenced, that the country no longer wanted warriors and only politicians. But even in this role, he gave it his all. He helped compile the history of the U.S. Army's campaigns in Europe. He reviewed after-action reports, studied movements, and annotated battle plans. He relived the war on paper, one battle at a time. In December 1945, Patton planned to return to the United States. He was looking forward to speaking tours, book deals, maybe even a political career, but fate had other plans. On December 9th, just weeks before his scheduled departure, Patton's car collided with a U.S. Army truck outside Mannheim, Germany. The impact was minor, but the injuries were not. Patton had been sitting in the back seat without a helmet. He struck his head on a metal frame and suffered a fractured neck. The injury left him paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days, General George Patton, the man who had raced across continents, who had faced down tanks and artillery, who had risen to the top of America's military elite, lay still in a hospital bed, unable to move. He died on December 21st, 1945, at the age of 60. His death shocked the world. Soldiers wept. Generals paid tribute. Even his critics acknowledged the magnitude of his loss. His body was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery alongside his men. By his request, he was laid to rest not with generals, but with the soldiers he led into battle. But Patton's legacy didn't end there. Over the decades that followed, his legend only grew. His speeches, his tactics, his eccentricities, they became the stuff of military folklore. In 1970, the film Patton, starring George C. Scott, brought his story to a new generation. The opening scene, a larger than life general standing in front of a giant American flag, delivering a speech filled with grit, profanity, and pride, became iconic. To many, Patton embodied the purest form of military leadership: direct, unapologetic, fearless. He believed war was brutal and that trying to sanitize it only prolonged the suffering. He believed in victory, not stalemate, in offense, not defense, and in discipline above all else. His critics argue that he was reckless, outdated, obsessed with glory, that his worldview belonged to an earlier era. But even they admit that when it came to winning battles, there was no one quite like George Patton. He was the general who led from the front, the man who made his troops believe that nothing could stop them, the commander who drove Third Army across Europe like a thunderbolt. He was complicated, flawed, brilliant, and unforgettable. That's how legends are made.